If you want to start making high quality videos, it starts with having a good foundation. Maybe you're someone who's coming from a photography background and you want to make the leap towards making more video content. Or maybe you're somebody who already makes videos, but you're just not fully satisfied with the look and feel of your final video content. Whatever the case is, in this video, I'm going to teach you the most foundational principles of video production in under 15 minutes so you can start making better videos.
You got to just press record.
So the first thing we'll talk about are frame rates, and this is one of the most important settings when capturing video. Frame rate refers to the amount of video frames that your camera is capturing every second, and then it's going to stitch those series of frames together to create video motion. Now, depending on where you live, you might be shooting in the NTSC format for video or the PAL format. And all that means is it corresponds to the different frequency ranges for the power grids in these countries. And so in North America, we actually shoot in the NTSC format. And the most common frame rates you'll see here are 24, 30, 60 and 120 FPS. And then the other countries that shoot in PAL format typically shoot in 25 frames per second is their most standard, and then 50 is more common for higher frame rate shooting. I know that's a little bit technical, but just take a look at this chart on screen and you'll be able to figure out which format you should be shooting in. When it comes to choosing which frame rate is best for your video, we usually recommend 24 or 30 frames per second for regular videos like YouTube videos, short films, and social media. And then 60 or 120 frames per second are typically reserved for shooting footage that might need to be slowed down later in post-production by leveraging these higher frame rates. So if you were to import 60 frames per second footage into a 24 frames per second editing timeline, that 60 frames per second clip is going to have a lot more frames than are necessary, and you're able to stretch out that clip and slow it down to meet that 24 frames per second timeline, and you're going to get slow motion footage when you do this. So that's a basic overview of how frame rates work. You're going to use 24 or 30 frames per second for regular videos, and then those higher frame rates for slow motion shooting. So next comes video resolution, and this refers to the number of pixels contained within each frame of video. So usually you'll see a measurement for the width and the height of the video frame in pixels, like 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels tall, and this would be a 1080p video frame known as Full HD. And then a 4K video frame would be 3840 by 2160, known as Ultra HD. And 4K and 1080p resolution are the two most common resolutions that you'll be working with for video. When you're creating YouTube videos or professional client work or even short films, 4K is usually the better option because you're going to get 4 times the amount of pixels to work with, which typically means the sharper and better your image is going to look. 1080p is going to work well for social media platforms like Instagram and Facebook, and it'll even look pretty solid on YouTube as well. There are higher resolutions like 6K and 8K, and also lower resolutions even, like 720p, but most people are going to use those less frequently, so you'll just stick to 4K and 1080p most of the time. Now, our next setting is shutter speed, and shutter speed refers to the length of time that your camera's sensor is exposed to light while shooting. So the slower your shutter speed is, the more light your sensor will let in, and the more motion blur you'll have as well. On the reverse, the faster your shutter speed is, the less light is going to be hitting your sensor, and then the less motion blur you'll have as well. Now, the standard rule of thumb for shooting video is that you always want your shutter speed to be double whatever your frame rate is that you're shooting. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, double that would be 1/48th of a second shutter speed, or as close as you can get, which would be like 1/50th of a second for a lot of cameras. Same goes for shooting in 60 frames per second. You would double that to 1/120 or 1/125 if that's what your camera can shoot at. Now, the reason this is important is because it creates the correct amount of motion blur for your video footage. Video is supposed to have a little bit of natural motion blur in it, so when you crank the shutter speed too high, it begins to look pretty choppy. So here's a little example. When I increase my shutter speed on this clip that was shot at 24 frames per second to 1/500th of a second shutter speed, this footage looks super weird. There's almost no motion blur anymore, and it looks very strange. But the same also goes for when I lower the shutter speed too slow. I'll drop it down to like 1/15th of a second, and this is way too slow, and now there's too much motion blur. Sometimes it's okay to play around with these a little bit to get some different creative looks, but for the most part, your shutter speed is always going to be double whatever your frame rate is. Now, since we have to shoot at a specific shutter speed for video, sometimes that image might look a little bit too bright, and we can use what's called a neutral density filter, or ND filter for short, which screws onto the front of your camera lens and is a filter that cuts out light from hitting your camera sensor. So think of this as sort of like sunglasses for your camera, which helps you shoot at these lower shutter speeds that are necessary for capturing the right motion blur. So if you're trying to dial in the right settings, but your footage still looks too bright, you're probably going to need an ND filter. The good news is actually these are pretty affordable. You just need to choose the right size for whatever lens you have. And we'll link a couple options down in the description below. Our next setting is aperture, and aperture controls how much light enters your camera through the lens, and it's measured in what's called f-stops, like f1.8 or f16, and you'll see these f-stop values on your lens a lot of the times. A lower f-stop value like f1.8 creates a really wide open aperture value, letting in lots of light, and it's going to give you a really nice blurry background and a good depth of field for beautiful looking shots. And this is great for isolating a subject from the background. Now, a higher f-stop number like f16 actually creates a really small aperture opening of your lens. So it lets in less light, but it then keeps more of your scene in focus. And this can be helpful on bright sunny days. If you don't want to crank your shutter speed, you can increase your f-stop number to reduce the amount of light hitting your sensor, or is even helpful in different video shots when you want more of your scene in focus. So that's how aperture works. And next would be ISO. And ISO is what increases your camera's sensitivity to light, which then makes your image appear brighter. So a lower ISO value like 100 means that your camera is going to be less sensitive to light, but also this means your image is going to look a lot cleaner and crispier. As you increase your ISO value, your sensor is actually going to become more sensitive to light, so your image is going to appear a lot brighter, but you're also going to be introducing digital noise into your image, and your image may appear kind of grainy if your camera doesn't have great ISO performance. So for the most part with ISO, you just want to keep it as low as you can while still obviously maintaining correct exposure. So shoot to keep your ISO between maybe 100 and 800 ISO, and if it's still too dark, I'd probably consider adding more lights into your scene to get that correct exposure. Now the last main setting is white balance, and setting your white balance ensures that the colors in your video look correct by adjusting for the different lighting temperatures you might encounter. So the most common white balance settings you'll choose are 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin. And what you'll do is set your camera's white balance to 5600 Kelvin when you're shooting in daylight environments, or you're using cooler temperature lights, maybe in your studio space. Like I'm using a 5600 Kelvin daylight colored light right now to light myself, so I set my camera's white balance to 5600. Now, if you're working with warmer lights like tungsten bulbs or warm interior house lighting, you're going to want to set your white balance to 3200 Kelvin to compensate for that warmer color temperature. And sometimes you're going to encounter mixed lighting conditions where you have daylight coming in through a window and maybe you have house lighting that's warm. Sometimes you'll have to split the difference a little bit, and you could try something like 4200 Kelvin as a good middle ground for your color temperature, or you could always leave your camera in auto white balance as a last resort, but typically we do recommend setting a manual white balance. So those are most of the key camera settings that we want to talk about, but now let's talk about audio, because audio is 50% of the video experience, so it's really important to have good audio. Most cameras actually have a built-in microphone, but those microphones aren't really great at all and mainly should just be used as reference audio or maybe as a last possible backup audio source. But there are three main kinds of microphones that you're going to want to consider, and just choose the best one based on whatever your content format is. The first style of mic are shotgun or boom microphones. So these are directional style microphones that work really well on top of a camera, or maybe even mounted overhead on some sort of light stand or pole. These microphones are great at picking up audio of whatever is right in front of them, usually at a distance around like 1 to 3 feet as well. Not much more than that, but these are gonna sound a lot better than your onboard microphone and can even be found as cheap as like $40 or $50 for a solid option. I really like the DD Mic D4 Mini. It's a really cool, small, budget-friendly microphone, or even the Rode Video Mic Go 2 is only $99. So these are some more affordable options for shotgun style microphones. We'll link a couple down in the description below. The second option would be a lapel microphone, and these are smaller microphones that are able to clip to the collar of your shirt to capture audio on a physical person. So these microphones can really help in situations where your subjects need the ability to kind of move around more freely and not be locked down to one location. One of the simplest solutions is just a standard 3.5mm lapel mic that just plugs directly into your camera, and now you're good to go with lapel audio. Within this same style of microphones are wireless microphone systems, and sometimes these actually have a built-in microphone to their transmitter, so you can actually use the physical like wireless transmitter as a lapel microphone, so that's pretty cool. And then also some of these wireless mic systems allow you to screw in a lapel mic to the transmitter, and now you can transmit your lapel microphone signal wirelessly to your camera. A few of our favorite wireless mic solutions would be the Hollyland Lark M2, the DJI Mic Mini and the Rode Wireless Pro. All of these have their different pros and cons, but we'll link some of these down in the description. And the third style of mic are podcast style microphones, which have a really rich, full sounding audio experience for your listeners. These mics often sound really great, but they also can require more hardware to get up and running. Like sometimes they require an audio interface, and it also requires you to be at a pretty stationary location really close to the microphone. There's so many great podcast microphones out there, like the Samson Q2U or Q9U. I love both of those. Or Shure makes a ton of great podcast microphones like the MV7 Plus, MV7X, or the Shure SM7B series. Again, we'll link some options down in the description if you want to check these out. Now let's talk about lighting. Lighting is really important because it can help you achieve your optimal camera settings, especially allowing you to shoot at those lower ISO values, which just gives you a better looking image overall. And the most common technique for achieving really great lighting is what's called 3-point lighting, where you use 3 different lights to light your subject. So let's break this down really quickly. The first light that you'll use is called the key light, and this is the most important light that is going to be the main light source for your subject. You're going to want to place this light at about a 45 to 30 degree angle towards the side of your subject, which is just going to help add some nice depth and texture to your face. You don't want it to be too straight on because your lighting will look a little bit too flat. Now the second light here is called the fill light, and you're going to put this on the opposite side of your key light at a lower intensity as well. And this is going to help soften those shadows that are created by your key light a little bit. And what's cool is this can even be just like a window, like you could put a window to your fill side, or even if you're really on a budget, like a reflector or a foam board for like $1, you can go buy a white foam board from the Dollar Tree and then use that to bounce the light from your key light back onto your subject, and that then acts like a fill light. And then the final light in 3-point lighting is called the backlight, and this is going to be a light positioned behind your subject to help separate them from the background a little bit. So this is really important and just helps your subject pop a little bit more from the environment, especially if you're wearing like a dark shirt on a dark background. It can be really helpful to add a backlight to separate your subject and just add some more depth to your scene. That's a basic rundown of 3-point lighting and something I actually use every single day. I'll link a few lights down in the description below that will work great for a 3-point lighting system. And the last thing that I'll touch on in this video is camera composition, coverage, and movement. So these are all creative ways in which we can leverage our camera to tell a better story. So the first thing is composition. And composition is the way that we frame up our shot and arrange elements in our camera frame. And here's where things like the rule of thirds come in. Maybe you've heard of the rule of thirds before. This simply means that you don't necessarily always want to position your subject directly in the center of the frame. Sometimes it can feel more balanced to place them on maybe a top third of the frame or even over to one side or another, which just reduces maybe the amount of headroom or the amount of dead space in your frame. It all depends on what kind of creative look you're going for, but leveraging the rule of thirds can be really helpful. You could also use leading lines, things like roads or fences, railroad tracks. These are all things with like literally physical lines that help guide a viewer's eye deeper into the frame, which just create a better sense of depth. So really there's a lot of ways you can compose your video shots to make them interesting. It's just going to take you some time to try these all and find your own creative style. Now coverage refers to the variety of shots that you capture during the filming process to just ensure that you have a really nice selection of shots to pull from when you're editing. So when I'm filming, I always grab a combination of really wide shots and then what we call mid shots, which are like, a little bit tight but not too tight, and then really tight shots, so wides, mids, and tights. And then I arrange these all together and mix them into creative sequences when I'm editing, just to make my videos feel more cohesive. So when it comes to coverage, you want to make sure you grab a variety of shots when you're filming to help you in post-production. And then finally, camera movement is also really important. And there's lots of ways that you can move a camera, but I'll just talk about a few here, which first and foremost is actually choosing not to move the camera, which is called a static shot. This is where you lock off your camera on a tripod like I'm doing right now. This is great for talking head style videos or showcasing really wide scenes. There's also handheld camera movement, and this is going to add a level of like authenticity or excitement to your video. It's really nice for making videos feel raw and less polished. There's also gimbal shots. So if you need really stable footage, you could leverage a gimbal to get really smooth shots. It's great for showcasing beautiful things like buildings, nature, and other things like that. There's lots of other camera moves too, but these are just a few basic ones. And right there is a complete rundown of some of the basic principles of video production. You now know more than most of the population when it comes to creating professional videos. And I hope that this video helps you feel more equipped when it comes time to make your own content. If you want to check out some of our favorite camera choices for beginner content creators, you can click or tap the screen right here, and we'll see you in the next video.